What is going on, everybody? Welcome to Pondering Christianity. Today we're going to be diving in on Galileo and religion, and did religion oppose Galileo and ultimately oppose science? That's what we're getting into today. If you're new here, welcome to the channel. Here we tackle things like Christian apologetics, near-death experiences, soon to be talking about deathbed visions as well. The channel has experienced some significant growth as of late, which is fantastic. So I want to first off thank God for that, and then thank everyone for your guys' support and continuing to come in and want to talk about these topics in greater detail. So that being said, thank you very much. And without further ado, let's get into the topic for today. All right. So I know that first off, I know my portrait, when I do the presentation and my face drops to the bottom right, it's going to get in the way of a few things. And so I'm going to just give you guys a heads up about that today now. But I am going to go ahead and obviously tell you what those things are. So let me give you a little bit of context as to why this is of interest. Now, I've heard a lot of atheist skeptics, as like YouTube atheist skeptics, for example, talk about how Galileo's situation of presenting the heliocentric model versus the geocentric model, and I'll explain what those are here in a moment, how that was kind of the beginning of religion attacking and opposing science. But that's not really the case, I found. I've been reading through Alistair McGrath's Christian theology, and this event has actually given quite a bit of writing within his book. And it paints this contextual picture of the situation that actually explains a lot more of the dynamics that were going on at that time that resulted in Galileo kind of ending up in the crosshairs of the papacy. So the heliocentric model is just quite simply that, heliocentric. It's a sun-centered model, basically saying that the universe has the sun at the center of it, or their understanding of the universe at the time has the sun sitting at the center of it, and then all the planets revolve around the sun. Versus with the geocentric model, this was based off of a traditional Bible literate interpretation where the universe revolves around the earth, the sun, the moon, and the planets. All of these things rotate around the earth, and the earth is at the center of it. And so this debate began to arise as Copernicus' book on the heavenly bodies had been published, and Galileo had read it and began championing the causes here. And so this kind of resulted in this situation, this backdrop that I'm going to explain to you guys now. Did religion really oppose Galileo and science ultimately is the question we want to answer. Okay, so here's the contextual backdrop. Like I said, I know it cuts off a little bit here down at the base, but I'll read it to you guys, of course. Okay, so here's kind of the backdrop, all right? In 1500, the church is going through a large amount of Reformation, okay? Now, this was called the Age of Reformation from 1500 to 1700 in Christian theology. And specifically, you have major Reformation beginning at 1500, and the Protestant church is going through quite a bit of Reformation at this time. Now, the Catholic Church, primarily most of this debate that was going on between the two major parties was Catholicism and Protestants, okay? The Protestants and the Catholics were debating a lot of different topics. They had a lot of different theological positions. If you're not familiar with theology, it's just a study of God. And so they had these different positions as to the divinity of Mary, the Holy Spirit, how salvation happens, who was Christ, what about Christ. So all these different studies about sin and humanity. And there's just all these new and interesting conversations going on at this time. And so there's a lot of ideas being reformed, okay? So this is the backdrop of this time frame. Now, Copernicus releases in 1543 on the revolutions of the heavenly bodies. And so this book was built around the idea that the universe rotates around the sun, and then him providing the evidence as to why that was the case. Now, what this was going up against was the biblical tradition of reading into the Bible and seeing passages within the Old Testament that would talk about how the sun rotated around the earth and taking that in a literal form. And so that created a contextual issue where these people misunderstood what exactly was being said within the Old Testament. And so how these worldviews were trying to kind of collide with one another was that Galileo was championing this cause, coming onto the scene and saying, okay, perhaps our understanding of what this meant is we misunderstand it. Maybe God was speaking to this person in a way that was not literal. It was an expressive format, right? It wasn't a literal format. It was a different format. And so that would open it up to say, okay, just because it says that the sun revolves around the earth, it's a symbolic language or a syllogism or something along those lines. And it's not necessarily saying that it has to be this way. And so Galileo is saying there's room for interpretation. Well, the problem with this was that in this time frame, right, there's this big battle going on, okay? And the reason being is Council of Trent was 1545 to 1563, okay? And that was the Catholic Council. It's almost kind of like the Council of Nicaea, if you will, more or less to what the Christian church had. The Council of Trent was the Catholic Church trying to get together and get their theologies on the same page and figure out, where they want to be uniform in their stances and how they want to portray those stances to the public. And the reason that this was an issue for them is because they were engaging in a lot of heavy debate with the Protestant movement of Christianity. And so these two sides had these compelling views. So this was a political battle, more or less, happening at this time frame of these two bodies of power within the Christian framework. We're kind of debating these ideas back and forth. And so this is the backdrop in which Galileo enters the scene. Now, Galileo is just trying to help out and provide everybody an updated scientific model of how the universe works and showing them that, hey, there is other interpretations of the Bible that can work here. But the church was not excited, specifically the Catholic Church, the papacy, the body of power within the Catholic Church was not excited about this idea because of they had just gotten done getting through this huge, you can see right here that Galileo starts to defend it in the 1600s, okay? And so you got to remember, back in these days, information, books, teachings, they take time. They didn't have the internet, they didn't have phones, they didn't have mail. They had letters that they could carry by horseback, but So information takes a little bit longer to kind of spread out, and people learn it, and then people become passionate about it enough to actually champion the cause and start to defend it and talk about it in public arenas. And so that's where Galileo is kind of coming in and defending this view, but he's got this last 100-year backdrop of all this Reformation happening within the church, and the Catholic Church, the papacy specifically, was to the point where they felt that they had their theological positions built within concrete. They had these strong positions that they didn't need to change. And here comes Galileo saying, hey, we might need to change this because it's not correctly interpreted. And so that is the backdrop in which Galileo enters the scene to present this idea. And so all this to say this, okay? It boils down to this. Galileo is coming in and trying to make a change for these people, okay? And update their views of how the world works and ultimately how it doesn't conflict with the biblical text. As a matter of fact, Galileo defends his position using biblical text and commenting on the biblical text and how they're not in contention with one another. But he's met with this political backdrop of this party has already been kind of what they feel getting their butts handed to them by the Protestant debates. And so they now have this kind of guy who they can kind of take their anger out on. And so that kind of results in that tension between the papacy and Galileo, because to me, it looks like they're just taking out their frustrations and anger on this guy, which is not okay by any means, but it does provide an understanding that it wasn't this religious movement of science cannot go against the word of God. It was more of this backdrop that the church had just spent all this time trying to figure out how to interpret it and where they want to stand on these positions and having an issue with interpretations to begin with. And now here comes somebody else to further reinforce why they should change that. And so ultimately, we as creatures hate change, and you see that in this situation unfolding, and that contextual backdrop makes a big difference. Not only that, Galileo he was seen as a theological layman, which just means he's a theological regular guy. Like, just a guy in the church who makes comments on theology, and in that time frame, and still kind of into this day, people see that as, well, you don't have the authority to be making the claims that you do. You don't have the study. You don't have the background to be making these theological claims that you do, which we know at the time Galileo was more of a scientist than he was a theologian. Nonetheless, it worked against him in the situation. His biblical views contradicted the geocentric biblical perspective. So, he was seen as a theological layman. He was presenting something that goes against what the church thought was, and up to this point, you have to understand Christianity is over 1,000 years old. And so the geocentric model, the earth-centered model that the universe was built with, this was considered common knowledge, common sense. Oh yeah, the earth is part of the center of the universe. And so this was just, he was fighting this old way of thinking with evidence, and unfortunately being met with just the stubbornness of humans to not want to change and like things the way that they are. Well, this is how we've always done things. Well, those things needed to be updated. And he was condemned by the official the papal Catholic body. So it wasn't all of Christendom that was upset with Galileo. Specifically, it was the Catholic Church upset with Galileo, and that had a lot to do with the fact that they had just gone through these centuries of theological debate of how the biblical text was to be interpreted, what liberties could you take with the interpretations, which could you not. So that being said, Galileo gets caught up in the middle of this big old Bible battle, all right, between the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church. And I'm going to totally mess up this name, so forgive me. But Yaquez Beni Basut, he was a Catholic proponent, had insisted that the teaching of the church is always the same. Novelty, and that's the end of the quote, but novelty was a hallmark of heresy. This is now Alistair McGrath's commentary on this. Novelty was a hallmark of heresy. So that's something that they were kind of frustrated with. And a lot of the issues that were coming out of the Protestant side of the house was they didn't like the fact that the Protestants were learning new ways to interpret the same text. They were finding ways to better interpret the same text, or finding over time as they studied and found connections across the biblical text that they could find out, oh, okay, maybe this wasn't a literal writing here. Maybe this was actually meant as an expression or some other form of writing, some other form of literacy for this person to understand. Kind of how we have different forms of speech. They were starting to see that when God spoke to these prophets in the Old Testament specifically, that he wasn't always using literal language. He was using a language that they could understand. And Galileo's interpretation of the Bible at this point seemed to represent an innovation. So again, this harkens back to the idea that they didn't necessarily want to oppose the idea of science. What really was the issue here was that they were upset that somebody else was taking a liberty with interpreting the Bible further and innovating further out of the Bible. That doesn't sit well with a party that was a little more traditional. To concede Galileo's interpretation of certain biblical passages would seriously undermine Catholic criticisms of Protestantism. So these are both on page 47 of Alistair McGrath's book. And he's just commenting on this to further reinforce the idea that Galileo was just caught up in the middle of this battle of, he's just trying to champion this scientific cause, but in a way that kind of combats a really popular biblical view up to that point. And that's just the way it goes, man. Innovators are always up against it because they're fighting a traditional way of thinking. And we know eventually he won out. That idea of winning out was there. But ultimately, the poor guy just got caught up in the middle of a religious political battle between the two sides. You can see right here, catapults are just hurling Bibles at one another. And so they were just hurling texts and verses at one another and making their points on how the Bible could be interpreted and what it said or what it didn't say and what that meant. And so ultimately, he just gets caught up in that. And so finally, Calvin, all right, John Calvin, the same guy who comes up with Calvinism, he actually came up with a lot of stuff. This is just part of it. Calvin to the rescue. Now, Calvin was alive prior to Galileo kind of really entering the arena with the papacy. But Calvin had written some significant some significant works on how we can interpret the Bible. Okay, and he actually comes up with this principle of accommodation. And what accommodation is it says that God speaks in ways humans could understand. So like a parent explaining something deep to a child, right? And so what Calvin's making the point here with accommodation is that in the Bible, we find that God is sometimes speaking in a way that seems incoherent to us now, with more understanding of kind of how the universe works, how the backdrop works, or maybe how the theology of these particular presentations work. Now, in the moment when God's speaking to the prophet or speaking to whoever he is speaking to within the Old Testament, you find God using a language that person can understand in that moment. And so after time goes by, it's interpreted to mean something different, because we now start to get the context of the situation in which that person received the message. For example, specifically referring to verses where these guys were talking about, the sun rotates around the earth. If you went and asked that person what God meant by that, I highly doubt they're going to tell you, well, he was explaining to me how the universe works. No, he was talking about something else. It could be a spiritual meaning. It could be something along those other lines. We're not really debating those particular passages at this moment. But ultimately, I'm just saying that John Calvin, who was a Protestant, had developed already up to this point the accommodation theory of God spoke in ways that people could understand. And so what John Calvin does with this is he leads the way for scientific thinking to have a happy marriage with biblical thinking or religious thinking, if you want to be general, and say, okay, look, God speaks sometimes in the Bible in ways that we might interpret incorrectly, and then over time we begin to learn that there is a different meaning involved there. And so you might, if you don't know any better, and you see the sun rotates around the earth and you don't know any better, you might think that that's exactly what he's talking about. He's trying to give you a model of the universe. But once you learn that that's not what he's talking about, then you're like, well, what was he talking about? And that's when it actually opens up to these new ideas of a spiritual representation. Now, accommodation was a view versus something called Bible literalism. I'm sorry, I wrote liberalism, but it's actually literalism. Belief the Bible speaks literally about everything. And I think most people would agree that's a dangerous way to go about reading the Bible now, because of how much we've learned, scientifically speaking, theologically speaking, over time, that there's a big difference between the literary types that you find within the Bible. So you can't take it all literally. But at this time frame, again, this was such a heated debate for that exact reason. So all this to say, when you get the context and you get the situation that Galileo finds himself in, you really see that this is just wrong place, wrong time. It's just a classic situation where you just walk into the room and people are arguing, and you're talking about something that maybe is as a sore subject for somebody in the room, and then they jump down your throat for it because you brought it up, but it was something else precluding you coming into that room that tells them you were the source of that. So ultimately, I think that this shows us that the situation with Galileo isn't in fact the beginning of religious prosecution of scientific discoveries or scientific thinking. If anything, it shows us that there were political parties at battle at the time, which is more or less what they were. I mean, they held a lot of power and influence at the time, but they were heavily debating with one another over what the Bible meant and how you could interpret the Bible. That makes a lot of sense in terms of creating a backdrop where someone like Galileo would just walk in and get blindsided by something that really didn't have anything to do with him. They weren't arguing against his scientific evidence. They were arguing against his biblical interpretations, and that's really what got him into trouble. But ultimately, like I said, there were Christian thinkers who had already learned about things like accommodation, and so they had started to see that the Bible was kind of speaking in different literary forms, and that there were different means of interpretations. So, so that is it for this video, guys. If you enjoyed it, do me a favor, hit the like button. If you like the channel and the content coming in, please hit that subscribe button. That would be a huge help. And if you get a little bit of time, watch some other videos. But hey, in the meantime, keep on pondering.